Okay, so I'm going to cover a couple of things. So I think Johnson has made quite a bit of progress. So, Johnson, if you have anything to add while I'm explaining this, please feel free to like jump in and like if I'm like missing out on anything, right? Because I'm sort of figuring this out along with you guys, right? But yeah, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is um, file formats because um, it can get a bit confusing, right? So um first type of set of file formats that we need to be aware of are robot descriptions, right? So this is basically the file that Gazebo uses to kind of put together the simulated robot, right? So the robot descriptions, there are two file types that you need to be aware of. One is called URDF, right? So URDF is a ROS format, right? So it's kind of being developed alongside ROS. So this URDF is generally a file format used in ROS robot descriptions, right? So Gazebo is not part of ROS, right? Gazebo is like a third-party physics simulator, right? But Gazebo has a ROS plugin, which is what we are essentially using, right? So ROS is like Gazebo is like a open source physics simulator, right? So ROS has just kind of used Gazebo functionalities to make it easier to simulate um, simulate robots and stuff, right? So in Gazebo, uh, the file format that you use is called SDF, right? So that's that's a file format sort of native for Gazebo, right? So Gazebo's like default format is SDF, right? But it also can use URDF, right? Um, but SDF is much broader. So the SDF file format can actually simulate a lot of things like lights. It can simulate, like all sorts of things that URDF can't. So URDF is exclusively for like robotics, right? So it's useful in things like describing joints, things like describing, um, sensors and things like that. While as SDF is much more broader, right? So I think it's easy. SDF is also easier because you can use the Gazebo has a thing called a model editor, right? Which is like a GUI tool, right? Which allows you to sort of visually edit your models, right? So most of the packages that you see that you're using, either the fetch or the turtlebot, is using the URDF format, right? Um, but uh, what you can do is you can easily convert a URDF model into SDF model, save it as a SDF model, and then instead of loading the URDF, you can load the SDF instead, right? Because I think the biggest advantage is this, the model editor, right? Because this allows you to kind of physically mess around with the file rather than actually going in and editing it, because this is what the actual URDF and SDF files look like. Let me just open something up so you guys can see it. So you guys can hear me, right? Okay, cool. Yeah. So if you go to the turtlebot, so I'm going to use the turtlebot as the example, but everything I'm talking about can be applied to the fetch as well. So in the turtlebot 3 package, right? Not the turtlebot simulations package, but the turtlebot 3 package, there is a folder called turtlebot 3 descriptions, and inside of that there's a folder called URDF, right? And this is the burger turtlebot model, and you can see this extension called sacro, right? Dot sacro. So if you open that, you can see what the URDF like tags look like, right? So this is like a tag based language, kind of like HTML or like XML or whatever, right? It actually uses XML, right? And so it's all tag based, so it's pretty easy. It's not like you have to compile it or anything like that. So it's really, you get each of these links and joins, right? So everything works as like links and joins, and you get to like set these parameters, and this is what the URDF file looks like, right? So remember again, the URDF is the ROS format, right? And what a SDF file looks like is very similar. So the Turtlebot 3 simulations actually has a bunch of SDF files, right? So if I open up the SDF file, so this is what the SDF file looks like, right? So it's very similar. It's also tag based, right? So you can see this is the URDF, this is the SDF, right? And there's quite a bit of overlap, but as I mentioned, the SDF is much more broader, right? You can sort of model a lot of things that URDF doesn't really include, right? So both your fetch and your Turtlebot right now is probably loading the URDF, right? So what I did is, the first thing, so okay, so we talked about file formats. The second thing is, since I kind of mentioned that there's a lot of advantages in using SDF over URDF, the second thing I want to talk about is how to load SDF descriptions in your launch file, right? So again, the advantage of using SDF is you can use the Gazebo model editor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to launch the URDF file, use the model editor, and save it as a SDF file, right? And then I'm going to show you how to load that saved edited SDF file onto Gazebo, right? So let's just launch the standard hold on. I'll have to kind of undo what I had done before, so give me a sec. So let's launch this Turtlebot 3 world file, right? This is the one. Okay, I'm gonna delete this one now. Alright, so this is the original Turtlebot launch file, right? So you can see here, while reading through it, that what it's doing is it's using that URDF format, right? It's loading the URDF Turtlebot model in this path, right? So it's in the Turtlebot 3 package, right? That's the one I just opened, right? So when you go to your Turtlebot 3 package, it's in this folder called Turtlebot 3 descriptions, and there's a folder called URDF. And when you launch this Turtlebot 3 empty world dot launch, what it's doing is it's using that URDF model, right? So if I just launch it, this is what it looks like, right? So this is similar to launching the fetch robot in one of the fetch environments, right? So if you look at the fetch launch file, you should be able to find something similar like this, some sort of line somewhere where it loads the model, right? So so this is the URDF model, right? So I'm going to show you guys how to kind of edit this in the Gazebo editor, right? and then save it as an SDF instead of a URDF, because once you use the model editor and you try to save something, you don't really get the option to save it as URDF. It only saves as SDF, right? So there's a small issue there, right? Because as soon as you use the model editor, you can't save it as a URDF anymore. It automatically saves it as a SDF. So then what you have to do is, instead of the URDF, load the SDF. Does that make sense? Or am I being confusing? Okay, cool. So let's just look at how to edit this. It's as simple as like right click, edit model, right? And then what you can do is you can add any of these shapes, right? So right, let's say we add cylinder, for example, right? And so this is why the model editor is easy, because you have all these tools up here, right? You can like scale it, for example, right? Which makes it so much easier, because the alternative, if you didn't have the model editor, is you would have to edit these URDF and .sdf files, right? So these are these like for example, you'll have to go into the geometry and the scale and kind of manually type those values in for like say the width and the height of these cubes and cylinders and things like that, right? But obviously it's much easier to just do it in the model editor, right? So let's just make a simple cube, simple cylinder, right? And then so this is the scale tool, and then this is like sort of the move tool, so you can kind of move it where you want to. I'm going to move it right in front of this, right? So when I save this, it automatically saves a SDF file like this, right? With all the edited stuff that you just did, right? So let me kind of sort of center this a bit. Right, so let's just leave it like this for now, right? The properties of this sort of cylinder you can view by right clicking, and there's a thing called open link inspector, right? When you open that, you can see that there are a bunch of properties associated with it. Since this is like a physics simulator, there's like mass, density, there's even things like friction and all sorts of stuff, but I don't think you guys need to worry too much about that stuff, right? But there is I think an important thing to understand, like when you can you see that there is a white box around the actual cylinder, right? So that is called a collision box, right? So that collision box is basically the box where the physics actually applies, right? So what you're seeing as a cylinder is sort of the visual element, and the actual physical interaction is going to happen with this box, right? So usually you would want this box to be the same size as your object, right? Because you want the interaction. So for example, if I come and collide with this, right? If someone comes and knocks onto this cylinder, it will actually knock at this point, right? Not on the cylinder itself, because this is the collision box, right? So what we would obviously want to do is kind of make it smaller, so you can go into the link inspector again and kind of I think there should be size for this. Yeah. Oh yeah, so it comes in like radius and length. So I'll actually, oh right, it's not the white square, it's actually, you can sort of see it here, right? So this is the collision box. In this case it's a cylinder, right? So the actual cylinder is the one inside, and then you can see sort of a shaded version around it. That's the collision box, right? So let's So if you go to the visual, so this is what we can actually see. So in the visual, you can see that this is the size of the radius, right? So for example, if I made this 0.1, right? You can see the thing sort of increases in size, right? So what you want to do is have the collision and the visual to be the same, right? So I'm going to set this to like 0.1 or something, right? And I'm going to make sure that the collision is also 0.1, right? So the collision is the one that's actually sort of inside right now, right? So now the collision and the actual visual representation are both the same size, right? Which is what we want, right? So for example, if the collision becomes bigger, you can see that this is the collision and this is actually inside is what you will see visually is the cylinder inside, and the collision box is what you're seeing as large here, right? So you would want the collision and the visual box to be sort of the same, right? All right, so now we have like a cylinder, right? And you can see here on the left side basically the model like all the objects in this model, right? So what you just added in is this link 0, right? So you can see that is highlighted. That's because what you added in is link 0, right? So this link is not attached to this robot at the moment. So the next thing you have to do is you have to create a joint between the robot and this cylinder, because if not, when for example this robot moves, this cylinder will be separate to the robot, right? Which we don't want, right? So we want to create a joint that connects these two objects, right? So to create a joint, there is a tool here called the joint editor, right? So we just click on that and you have to pick a parent and a child, right? So the parent is going to be the main robot base, right? So you can select the parent here and set this as the parent, and as for the child you can select the cylinder, right? So now link 0, you can see a line connecting it, is attached to the base footprint. Cool. So now we have a cylinder attached to the sort of the robot, right? So you can pick what sort of joint as well. I'm going to pick a fixed joint because I don't want it to like rotate or anything like that, and then I say create, right? So now I created this cylinder that's attached to my robot, right? Now you could have created a sphere, you could have created a cube, whatever, right? So that allows you to kind of create this object, right? So now when you save this, right, you can save it wherever you want to, right? So I'm going to just create a folder somewhere, and I'm going to actually create a folder, and I'm going to call it I don't know, my turtle bot. Okay, and in there I'm going to save this, right? And when I go ahead and look at that folder, you can see that it's kind of saved these two files. One is the SDF file and a configuration file, right? So now what we essentially did is we started with the simulation, right? That was running a URDF file, right? We went to the model editor and we edited it, and when we saved it, it has saved as a SDF file, right? And if you open up this SDF file, right, and you scroll down, you can see that you can see the names of all these links that were there, right? And you can see link 0. This is the one we just created, right? And all the properties have been automatically created for us. The location, the mass, like basically the model editor automatically sort of created all that stuff for us, which is great, right? You can see here that there's a tag called geometry, so that describes the shape. For example, if I change this from cylinder to cube, or square or whatever, it'll change sort of the shape of it, right? The geometry of that. And then you can see a material tag and a whole bunch of stuff, right? So now what has happened is I have essentially converted a URDF, I've edited it and saved it as SDF file, right? So now let's see if how we can load this SDF file, right? So actually there's a small step I haven't added here, right? So what we just did was actually learning the model editor, right? So the third thing we are going to do is load the SDF file. Right, so what we did in the model editor is we loaded the URDF, we edited it, right, and then we ended up saving it in SDF format. Cool. So now let's see if we can load that SDF file, right? So if you go into the launch file, so for this I will actually provide you guys with sort of a file that you can use to load SDF, right? I'll send this to you guys in email, right? I've actually saved it here. All you have to do is, so it's this file called spawn_sdf.launch. I'll send this file to you guys. All you have to do is put it into your launch folder, right? The launch folder that you'll be using, if it's your fetch robot, in your fetch launch folder, if it's your turtlebot, in your turtlebot launch folder, right? Where the launch file for your simulation is, right? So if we open this, you can see that it sets the location you want to spawn the SDF file, right? It gives you the XYZ values, right? And here so it kind of describes where to sort of set the SDF like load and set the SDF file, right? So you need the spawn_SDF file. It uses this node called in Gazebo, right, called spawn, and it spawns the SDF file, right? So all you have to do is copy that into your launch folder, right? And then your actual launch file that you're using, so we were launching the turtlebot empty world, right? If you open that, right, if you open that, you can see that this is where the URDF file is being loaded, right? So we need to get rid of those lines. We don't want it to load the URDF file. We want to get it to load our SDF file, right? So you delete those lines where it's loading the URDF, right? And instead, again, I will give you guys this bit of code, right? Instead, you copy this stuff, right? So what it does is, remember that spawn_SDF launch file, it launches that inside your other launch file, right? So instead of spawning the URDF, it's going to spawn the SDF instead, right? And you can give a name for the robot and stuff, right? This I actually copied from another tutorial, so it says pillow here, but you can give a different name to it, right? Yeah. Yeah, so you mean the old one, right? So the problem with this is I tried it, but it's using a different node, I think, right? To load the it's using a node to load the URDF instead of SDF, right? So you can sort of instead of that, it's better to use this. Like I couldn't get it working with the. That's what I originally did. I tried to change the path there, but it didn't work out. Right. So you need to like spawn the SDF in particular, right? So you might be able to set the launch like the location of the spawning here and pass it as a what do you call it? Actually, so this set of stuff is kind of redundant because it's essentially the same arguments, right? So just go through it and it will make sense to you. Like either you can delete this bit, right? Or basically all the spawning stuff is happening here, right? You get to decide where you want to spawn it, and it calls that other spawn underscore SDF, right? These are the default values, right? So in this file you can spawn it wherever you want to, right? Yeah. So what we're doing now is we are spawning the SDF file, right? And you need to give the path to the SDF file, right? So here what it does is you can give the full path, or it finds a particular package when you use the word find, right? And I think it's best to put it in this folder called models inside your inside your package, right? So so inside Turtlebus simulations Gazebo, there should be a folder called models, right? So the edited file that you just saved, this one, right? I'm just going to copy and I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to save. I'm going to paste our edited version, right? So now what it's going to do is it's going to load the edited version when I launch this launch file, right? So let me just click launch it. So as you can see now, what it did, it launched basically that edited SDF file that we just made, right? So for example, if I run the teleop, yeah, did I delete? Yeah, I think you might have to load this Sacker. I'm not sure. Give me a sec. Gazebo is really annoying sometimes. You need to like launch it twice for it to work. So you can see that when I do the teleop, it's running, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. Awesome. So now we have a custom SDF version that's running instead of the original URDF, right? So it's just a matter of linking the right model here in this, right? So wherever you've stored your edited SDF version, you need to give the path to that here, right? Yeah, cool. So you can set where it kind of spawns and all sorts of stuff, right? So that's how you load. So this bit of code, along with the what was it? The launch. This one, spawn underscore SDF. This bit of code, I will share with you guys. So for the fetch robot, by the way, Johnson, if you got everything working, you don't have to kind of follow exactly what I did. So there's like multiple ways you could do this, right? So for example, instead of doing everything I did, you could straight away, for example, edit the URDF file, right? And then you don't have to do any of this stuff. You just load the URDF file with no problem, right? So the only reason I'm going around this route is because the model editor is quite convenient, right? But the problem there is it saves it as SDF, which makes us have to go through this step, right? So whatever way you manage to get it done, as long as it makes sense, there's no like single way written in stone that you have to do this, right? So if you found a quicker way to do this, by all means, right? Okay, so we managed to load this SDF file, right? But now comes the interesting part. Like, what if you want to, instead of just a random cylinder, add a custom sort of mesh and texture, right? So this comes down to basically what you guys are both trying to do, which is to add some sort of marker or a tag, some sort of April tag or whatever sort of marker that you want some sort of visual tracking to happen, right? So how do you add sort of a custom tag to all of this instead of sort of the basic shapes that you can find in Gazebo, right? So for this you will need a 3D software called Blender, right? So it's an open source software that you can easily download. So you just go get blender.org and in downloads you should be able to download sort of the either the Windows version or the Linux version, right? So the Linux version is pretty simple. It's just a zip file that you have to unzip and then you can run it, right? So everything I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a custom model, right? And then I'm going to edit this SDF file and add that custom model to it along with like the textures, right? So what you do is once you've installed Blender, you just open Blender. So Blender is a pretty powerful 3D tool. You can do a lot of like really cool 3D rendering, and you can even do like 2D animation and all sorts of stuff on Blender, right? But we are just going to do a very basic thing. So as soon as you start Blender, you start with like a cube, right? So you can kind of scale the cube, right, in any way you want, right? And so if you want to set a particular size for it or whatever, you can do that, right? So I'm going to make it small, right? So maybe try to make it the same size you would actually want it to appear in your final model, right? You can also scale it later on when you're adding it to the SDF file, but I guess it makes sense to kind of, let's actually start with 1 meter by 1 meter, right? And then I'll show you how to scale it later on if you want to, right? So you start with this cube, right? So in Blender, once you make your custom format, you have to export it in a file format called .dae, right? So when you export the .dae, you will only get the mesh, as in you'll only get the 3D shape. You won't get the sort of the texture on top of it, right? So what we have to do is kind of add those textures separately, right, and save them, right? So there's a function called texture painting here, right? So you just click that, right, and you can see that there is a sort of like a unwrapped version of this cube here that you can see, right? So what you have to do is you have to save this texture as a 2D image, right, and then kind of wrap it onto the 3D image. So I know that sounds complicated, but honestly, I'll just show you guys. It's not that difficult to do, right? So what you're seeing on the left side is sort of an unwrapped version of this cube, right? So whatever texture that we kind of put on this cube will be kind of put into a 2D image. And then later on in Gazebo, we can load the mesh, that's the 3D thing, separately, and this 2D texture, and combine the two to form an image, right? So so let's create this 2D texture first. So to do that, you have to just say new, right? I'll also send you guys like a link to a YouTube video on how to do this, but I'll also upload this video, so it'll be easy for you guys. So let's just make a name for it. Let's call it marker, right? And so I've created this mesh. Let's actually just give it a color instead of black. So let's just make it blue or whatever, right? So you have this entire section is kind of blue, but it shouldn't worry you guys. Okay, so you can see that this is like the unwrapped version of this box, right? So what you have to do next is here you can see this like a screwdriver and a wrench icon. You go there and you have to set this texture first, right? So you have to say single image, was it? Yes, you have to select single image, right? And then say and then you have to actually we'll name this first. Let's call this so here on the left side we are creating that sort of a canvas that we can kind of paint onto, right? So let's call this the cube cube faces, right? So here on the right side we need to kind of attach it to this cube, right? So here we select single image and we say cube faces, right? So now we've kind of added this onto this actual cube, right? Next we need to kind of add that sort of tag that you guys want to add onto the image, right? So I'm going to use Johnson's tag for this. I think I had it saved somewhere. So I think it was so I'm going to put everything in this one folder, yeah, right, just to make it easier, right? So this is the tag that Johnson's using, right? So in your case, in Kyle's case, it will be like a April tag or something, right? So whatever tag that you're going to use, right? So we have that there. So what we have to do is go to this icon here, this checker box icon, right? Click the plus icon and here say new, sorry, say open, and go ahead and add that texture onto that, the marker, right? So now we have the marker here. Cool. Then go back to this wrench icon, right? Minimize this, and here under brush settings there should be another drop down arrow called texture, right? And in this texture, instead of tiled, we are going to select something called stencil. So what that allows us to do is kind of paint it on top of this cube, right? So we have this texture here now, right? And this cube, we just need to sort of align it with that texture. So to move this texture around, you have to right click and you can move it around, right? And if you want to kind of lock this to a nice perspective, you can use these icons here, right? So if you want the X face to be sort of painted, you can just do this, and now we have this nicely aligned over the X face, right? So I can just move this on top of this, zoom in with my scroll button, right? And then kind of align it onto the cube. Again, I will send you guys a tutorial on how to do this, but it's usually on a more complicated sort of object, not like a cube, because no one, like, people use Blender to kind of model like complex objects. So actually just using a cube is much more easier. By the way, if you want to kind of align this cube easily to one of these axes, you can either use this tool on the top that I'm kind of clicking, right? Or you can use your numpad, and when you press 1, 2, 3, it kind of cycles through the faces in a nice flat 2D view instead of a 3D view, right? So this is the 3D view. For you to kind of lock it onto a face, right, you can cycle through this like this, right? So now it's locking onto X, right? So after that, what you do is you kind of align it onto the, you can move this texture using the right click button, right? You have to press the right click button to move it, and then kind of put it on top of the cube where you want it to be, right? And then release your right click and just paint over this like this, right? So it's kind of like a stencil pretty much, right? We're using like a stencil effect to do this. So when we do that, yeah, now I'm left clicking. Yeah, I'm left clicking it, right? So once I do this, I should now have it sort of, you can see on the left side kind of, why is it blue? Shouldn't. Yeah, I don't know why there's a slight blue tint to it. Okay, there isn't, right? Okay, so once we do that, we need to, there is a slight blue tint to it, I don't know why. Okay, yeah, sorry, here the blend should not be mix, it should be, this didn't happen to me before, I don't know what's wrong. Give me a sec to figure it out. Actually, we could just, let me quickly just do that again, right? So I create a new, I'll just make a blank white thing this time, right? Let me just quickly redo this. Cube. Right. Yeah. Hold on, guys. It's deciding to bug out on me for some reason. Okay, right. Sorry. Hold on. Right. Okay. I forgot to do this. Okay. All right. Here we go. All right. So now we basically have it kind of painted onto this cube, right? So from this texture painting mode, we go back into layout, right? But when you go into layout, you can see that the cube's texture is not there anymore, right? To actually, what we did was we just painted it, right? But we didn't actually add it onto the cube, right? So what we've essentially done is we painted this 2D image. So make sure you save it, right? You go to save as, and I'm going to save it in the same folder. I'm going to call it cube texture, right? Cube texture. Okay, and I'm going to save that. And then I go to layout mode. So this was the texture painting mode that we were using. Go to the layout mode, and this is what the actual cube looks like. But right now, as you can see, you haven't really added it onto it. So to add it, you go into, there's a thing called the material properties. You go into that, right? And here you get an option called base color, right? So next to base color, you have this small dot icon. So instead of so base color you get to kind of add a color to something, right? So what we want is not to add the color, but we want to add that texture that we just created in the texture painter, right? So you can sort of undo that, and here on the right side of that, there's a small dot. When you click that, you get a drop down menu, and here there's a option called image texture, right? So we just created a texture. If you want to actually see it, you can select image texture, and you can open and just put that PNG file that we created, right? So this is what the actual PNG file looks like that we just created, right? So if I select that, right, you can see that it has been added onto the cube, right? Again, you can change some other properties in this, like how bright it is and things like that. By the way, if you actually want to see the thing, you have to go into this mode over here on the top right corner. This is like the rendered mode, and this is what it will actually end up looking like, right? So what you want to now do is you want to export this as a DAE file, right? But remember, when you export this, you will be only exporting the cube shape. You won't be exporting this texture, right? The actual texture is this file, this PNG file that you created before in the texture painter, right? So the DAE file just contains what we call the mesh, not the texture, right? So you say export and then DAE, and I'm going to put that in this file as well. I'm going to call this the cube mesh. Cube mesh, right? So now we have the mesh and the texture, right? The only reason I kind of added this texture back on this is to show you guys what it looks like. If you wanted, you don't even have to do that. You can just export that blank sort of cube like this, and then add that texture separately, right? Okay, so I'm going to save that. So we've created a custom mesh and a texture. Now we need to add that into our model, right? So to do that, first let's add the mesh, right? So I go to where my SDF file was saved. By the way, guys, I hope I'm not like losing you guys. If at any point I'm kind of if anything is difficult to understand, let me know, I'm just I realize I've been talking for the last 45 minutes. So okay, how about you, Kyle? Okay, awesome. Okay, cool. So now remember the SDF file that we created before using the Gazebo. We added a cylinder, right? So I'm just going to go into that folder that we made. So this was what we had, right? Basically the turtle bot with a cylinder attached to it, right? But we don't want the cylinder. What we want is the cube that we just made instead, right? So what we have to do is we have to edit this and attach that mesh onto it, right? To do that, we need to create a new folder called meshes, right? And so the DAE file that we just made using Blender, we need to copy that here, right? So that's this. We add that into this folder called meshes, right? So what we then do is we go to the SDF file, right? And instead of the cylinder, we are going to edit it to show the mesh instead, right? So if I open this and I edit it, you can see that there should be a part called link 0 over here, right? So in this, there should be a tag called geometry, right? So this section. So instead of the cylinder, we're going to delete that section, right? And we are going to add that mesh that we just created. Okay, so I'm just going to copy paste a line of code and I'll explain it later. And again, I will share all of these like small code stubs with you guys later, right? So let me just grab that bit of code. Where did I put it? Right, so I just have to put the name of that mesh, right? So this is where we created that folder called meshes, right? And the name of the mesh that we created is called cubemesh.dae, right? So what you have to do is give the path to that location, right? So in that geometry tag, instead of the cylinder that we just created, right, I'm just going to add the path to the mesh that we just created, right? So it's sort of a relative path. You don't have to give the full path to the location because it's in that folder that describes the entire model, right? So you can use this sort of model part and then add this bit so that you can add that mesh, and then you can even scale it, right? So we had a 1 meter by 1 meter. I've like scaled it to a smaller size, right? So now where the cylinder used to be, right, will be this new mesh. Okay, but the advantage of using a model editor is it was easier for us to kind of place that in the right location, and it was easier for us to create a joint between that location and sort of the robot, right? Because otherwise we'll have to kind of edit everything from scratch and create this sort of custom object and stuff here. So what we've done is we've just replaced that bit with the cylinder with the mesh that we want, which makes things a bit more easier. So if I actually launch that file again, because I've actually set it to launch this model, you can see that it will actually launch a cube instead of the cylinder that we had. What? Right. Okay, thanks. Yeah. So there should be a mesh tag. Right. Thanks. So yeah, you need to mention that it's a mesh instead of like a blank shape. So you open the tag and then you have to close the tag. Right? Thanks, Johnson. All right. So now if I launch it, it should pretty much replace. Yeah. So you've replaced it with a cube, right? But now the advantage is the joints that we created before still is already sort of added onto it, right? The joint that we created and stuff, right? Which is beneficial. Otherwise, what will happen is if you move your turtlebot, the cube will stay in one place, right? Or the cube might even stop the turtlebot from moving. But now they're both attached to one another, and so now we've attached the mesh. The next thing to do is attach the texture, right? So to attach the texture, we need to make another folder called was it texture? There's a top folder above that, right? I think it's materials. Yes. So yeah. So you need to create a folder called materials. And inside of that you have to make two folders, one called scripts and another one called textures, right? So in the textures folder, right, in the textures folder you add the texture that we just created, right? So so in Blender we created that cube texture, right? The one that's kind of unwrapped, right? So we add that there in the textures folder, right? And then in the scripts folder we have to make a file that describes how to use that texture, right? So again, you don't have to write these from scratch. I'll give you guys like an easy code to use, and you can find it on the Gazebo website as well, right? So I'll copy paste that and I'll kind of explain it so that it makes sense. Let me quickly copy and paste that. So you create a folder with your own, a text file with your own name with a .material extension. And when you edit it, this is the code that you need to put in. The first line is basically you have to use this keyword material and give it your own name, right? So I'm going to call it my marker / diffuse, right? And all of this stuff has to, so all of this stuff I'll give you guys. What you have to do is just simply add this line of code, right, called texture, and in front of it you have to give the name of that texture file, right? So the name of the texture file that we are using is called cubetexture.png, right? So cubetexture.png. So what we essentially did is we copied that texture that we created in Blender, and in the scripts folder we've kind of described how to use that texture, right? So there are more properties you can set here if you want to, like how much of emissivity do you want on the surface, like how reflective should it be and things like that, right? But I'm just going to use a simple material like this, right? So now we have the actual texture and basically a script that describes how that material kind of functions, right? Now what you need to do is connect that again to your SDF file, right? So if you go to your SDF file, there should be a section so again, everything has to be done under link 0, right? Because that's kind of the link that we created. So here you should see a section called material, and under that section called material, there should be a section called script, right? So this material tag, you will have to delete all of this, right? Because this is right now using the Gazebo materials, right? And you don't, I mean, you could leave these emissivity and diffusiveness and the ambient stuff if you want to, but I'm just going to get rid of all of that. You need the script tag, right? And instead of these two lines, so right now this is the material that it's using, right? The gray, Gazebo gray material. What you would want to do is, instead of that, you want to add the material that you created, right? So you delete that, and again I'm just going to copy paste from here. You need to add these 3 lines. So one is a link to your texture folder, and one is a link to your scripts folder, right? And then you have to mention the name that you gave. So the name that we gave was my marker / diffuse. So once you do that and save this, right? Now on top of that mesh, we are going to be able to add the texture as well. Sorry, I didn't put the proper name, did I? Hold on. Why is this not working? I should give it a different name. Maybe it's confusing with. What's this? Johnson, did you spot any mistakes I made? Or? Yeah. Yeah. So this is sort of like a relative path. So it tells you from the model file itself where to go to, but yeah, you can give the full path. It should work. Gazebo bugs out sometimes, which is annoying. Okay, just give it a sec. Okay, there we go. Alright, so I have no idea what went wrong. So just remember, Gazebo is a little buggy, so sometimes you might have to just open it a few more times, right? So yeah, so I seem to have attached the face along the x-axis of the cube. So just make sure you, when you're drawing it on Blender, you draw it on the right face. But yeah, so another thing you could do is you could even rotate this, right? Using the model editor, right? You can go edit model, and you can kind of rotate this cube if you want to, right? So I think this is rotate. There we go. Right. So that's the advantage of having the model editor, right? But the only issue, as I mentioned, is everything you do in the model editor gets saved as the SDF file, which is why you need to be able to load SDF files, right? But yeah, that should get you to add your own sort of custom tag to your let me save this. Where is that? Yeah, so as you can see, yeah, this is essentially what you want. Obviously you can play around with the size of this. I just did a quick and dirty, easy, straightforward thing to like a fast tutorial. Obviously when you're making this, make it smaller. Maybe you can play around with the weight values and maybe give it a really light weight, because that will otherwise affect the performance of the turtle bot, because it is a physics simulation, right? So it actually takes into account things like weight and thrust and things like that, right? But yeah, that's it. So let me just quickly summarize everything, right? So there are these two file formats. One is used in ROS, one is used in Gazebo, the SDF format. Most of your simulations will be written in the URDF format. You completely have the option to go and edit these URDF files by hand, right? But I found that the model editor is a easier, quicker way to do it visually. But the catch with the model editor is that it saves in SDF format, which the workaround for that is you need to load the SDF file instead of the URDF file. So for that, I will give you guys the code. Right, so how to load that SDF file. And then I think the most difficult part is creating this custom mesh and texture using Blender, right? Because that's like a software that not many people have the experience to use. But if you follow exactly what I did, you should be able to add your own sort of texture onto it. I'll also link you guys to some additional like video tutorials on how to add a texture on Blender, but most of those tutorials aren't like simple shapes like a cube, right? They like the one I watched was, I think they were like texturing apples and a knife or something like that. But I'll send you guys those links also. But I'll upload this video that we just did. So I recorded everything. I'll upload this tomorrow, because I need the university internet to upload this video, because my upload speeds at home are not